welcome to another conversation with Middle East Monitor. My name's Amelia Smith and I will be your host for today's conversation. The topic for today's show is the UN's Climate Change Conference, COP27, which will this year be held in Egypt. In November, heads of state, ministers, civil society activists and journalists will all gather in Egypt's Red Sea resort city of Sharm el-Sheikh to discuss issues critical to tackling the climate emergency. However, the decision to host this year's conference in Egypt has come under heavy criticism because of the country's appalling human rights record. So, to discuss the summit further, as well as Egypt's own attitude towards climate change and civil society, I'm joined by Yasmin Omar, an international human rights lawyer and UN and regional mechanisms manager at the Committee for Justice. Yasmin, thank you so much for joining us here this afternoon. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much, Amelia. The pleasure is mine, and thank you so much for covering such a timely and vital issue. It needs a lot of discussion and a lot of unbreaking for everyone.
Thank you. So, Yasmin, I'd really like to start with Egypt's own environmental record, which has come under heavy scrutiny in the last few months, particularly as we approach COP27. And one of the big criticisms is that the government in Egypt is constructing highways through old neighborhoods. It's raising thousands of square meters of green spaces, of trees for urban development. What laws are there in Egypt to protect green spaces?
Well, there are a bundle of laws, and it's been increasing recently. And this is actually a good thing to see a country like Egypt taking steps and setting laws and having people in authority sitting together and trying to figure out how to frame care about the environment within the legal frame. However, we are like any other attempts, I see it as theatrical, because while we see increasing erasing of green space, it's not necessarily related to development plans. So we haven't really seen an explanation from the government relating erasing historical green spaces from Cairo, Alexandria, and other major cities to development plans. But when it comes to development plans itself, the state has been taking mega development plans and projects that not necessarily are sensitive to the environment or created to enhance the lives of the Egyptian people. For example, a mega project like the Egyptian, the new administrative capital that includes skyscrapers in the middle of the desert. Look at the waste, energy, water, and it's not really necessary or required for development in this area in Egypt, and not necessarily saving energy and resources. While we could use these resources to enhance infrastructure to face the global warming and increasing rain in the winter that mainly touches and affects the lives of those who are marginalized, the poorer classes of Egypt. Not only that, but also development in its own way is not really designed to treat issues that are already there. We are seeing victims of enforced evictions, displacement are more susceptible to climate change than those who are that benefit more from new administrative capital or new projects that provide luxury housing. The law is great and the strategy is great. However, we don't see really application on the ground, and it does not consider other practices that violates other rights.
Okay, so I mean, you touched a bit on this in your answer to the previous question, but Egypt is highly vulnerable to climate change. I mean, we're talking extreme weather, rising sea levels, droughts. Who in Egypt will be most affected by climate change?
As you said, yes, I touched a bit on this, but marginalized sectors are a lot in this case. First, farmers who have been affected by the decrease of the green space, and of course, climate change, global warming are affecting the crops production. And Egypt currently is heading towards a food emergency because of the decrease of necessary crops. And this is all because we needed addressing this issue of climate change years ago, enhancing the infrastructure to help the most marginalized people, to enhance the infrastructure in Egypt to be able to accept the weather changes. However, we're seeing that instead of doing that, we're using the resources to create a park that is 10 times size of Central Park, like President Sisi said. And we don't know how this will benefit the Egyptian people while the crops in the food sector is being affected. Not only that, but also the new strategy and the laws does not address investments, studies, and effects on the environment and the Egyptian people. Egypt has been calling for investors to come and invest in Egypt. New projects have been taking in part on. However, we don't see really the effect of these projects on the daily life of Egyptian people. And therefore, maybe investors will come and invest here because we don't have a strong legal frame that protects Egyptian people from carbon emission, the increasing carbon emissions, or from chemically wasting Nile River. There are a lot of practices by businesses that are not addressed. And as I said, the more marginalized people who are on the borders are more affected by it.
And so, I mean, earlier this year, the government announced the National Climate Change Strategy, billions of dollars. They said it will mitigate all these risks. Do you think this will be any more effective, or?
Well, I see that this is only an attempt to get in more debt and get more aid and claim that we're doing projects that serves the environment. However, we could serve the environment by already working on issues that we have and stop wasting resources on unnecessary projects. I would say that also any attempts by the state to enhance the issue of climate will lack the contribution of civil society and social dialogue. How would the state understand the challenges without addressing it with researchers and academics and people who are hands-on on the subject? It's not just neglecting to include those who are most experienced in the issue, in the conversation, but the state is also targeting them for taking on this type of work, for mobilizing around environmental or even civil society participation in the environmental conversation. And this atmosphere does not really create successful policies that could address the issue. The state said that the national strategy is from now to 2050. And there are studies that says that we don't even have time to 2050. A city like Alexandria could suffer from the rising water levels long before this time. And I don't think that people who live in this endangered city, for example, are included in the conversation, or that they are taking into account because they will be forcibly displaced, they will be in danger, and I don't think the state is including this in the strategy.
So speaking of civil society and looking forward to COP27 in November, you know, as you mentioned, every day I feel like the grip is tightening on civil society in Egypt. It's getting worse and worse. But at the same time, civil society is such a fundamental part of bringing about, you know, of tackling the climate emergency. So with this in mind, why has Egypt been chosen to host COP27?
Well, it's actually, I don't see it as a bad thing. We're hosting COP27 in Africa is necessarily because our continent is facing a lot of challenges when it comes to environment, climate, and indigenous people. And Egypt here is representative of the African continent. However, the question here is, what are the criteria when picking countries to host UN summits? We've been speaking to UN officials and to the international society calling that UN summits in general should be held in countries that respect human rights, respect the right to expression, assembly, and association. But as an Egyptian human rights defender, I find it as a unique moment to voice those concerns. And well, it's a very bureaucratic process to pick the countries that hosts UN summits, and it minds representation of the countries, and it's like a revolving door. Each country takes its turn, which is we don't really I don't really object it. However, I think that it's important to maintain credibility and to maintain that choosing the states that will hold UN summit should maintain successful and meaningful participation in those discussions. The attack on civil society, as many of us know, did not really start now. It starts since President Abdel Sisi took power in 2013, and evidently we see that there is a prosecution against the civil society in mass. Case 173 is still ongoing and continuing. A lot of leaders of civil society in Egypt. But under all these circumstances, it's not only enough that there is a major crackdown, but the Egyptian government selected about 36 organizations to participate in COP27. And this complicated the participation of independent organizations that does real and effective work on the environment. However, therefore, we see that the state has presented its own voice in the conversation and discussions in COP27, and this will threaten the success of holding such an important and vital discussion, especially in a country like Egypt. The state keeps saying that, oh, we have a low carbon emission. We're not causing the world we're not contributing into destroying the world. However, you're contributing to destroying the lives of the Egyptian people who are currently suffering from neglection. Civil society organization has been doing great work, from strategic litigation to research to providing data, but they are suffering not only from a crackdown, but also from the lack to access, from the lack of a relation with the stakeholders, people who make the decision, policymakers. All these challenges we have been calling onto the world to voice it, since we can't participate. Those who are in Egypt facing reprisals, travel bans, asset freeze, are unable to even be in the surroundings of COP27 because of the heavily securitizing and, of course, overall restrictions.
And so that has been a big debate as we kind of approach the conference in November, is whether protests will be allowed, because they're a big part of the climate summit. And, you know, the foreign minister has said he's going to designate a special facility, and protesters can protest kind of adjacent to the main center. What does international law say about protests, when and where they can be held and how?
Well, the right to protest should not be limited by a place or a time or a message. People should be able to peacefully express their opinion the way they choose and the way they find effective. And last year in Glasgow, for example, people stormed the streets in thousands, expressing themselves. Some were smearing blood over themselves, some were taking off their clothes, some were chanting, some were yelling. This is the way that people express themselves peacefully. However, people in Egypt cannot express themselves even on social media. People cannot write a post or a tweet because the punishment, the reprisals here is spending unlimited time in dark cells in Egyptian prisons. While the state said, yes, we'll allow protesting in a certain designated area, that does not really answer to the requirement of extremely free speech during UN's important summits. And also, the structure of Sharm el-Sheikh is very, very heavily securitized. It's not just the right to protest that is endangered here. The right to privacy due to heavy surveillance in Sharm el-Sheikh, the right to protect your information, since communication companies are obligated to give users data to the government without judicial review. That endangers everyone, not only Egyptians, everyone who participate in COP27. The legal frame of terrorism is very broad and is used against everyone to punish them for practicing their fundamental human rights. Why is this not endangering everyone who is participating in the conversation and in the event? We are saying that this legal frame is draconian and does not fit for free conversation that fix a very dangerous situation.
And so several human rights organizations are saying, you know, we should use this as an opportunity to really spotlight human rights abuses in Egypt, you know, some of which you've mentioned. And for example, some key figures, for example, the author Naomi Klein, Green Party MP Caroline Lucas have called on the Egyptian government to release thousands of political prisoners ahead of the conference. Do you think Egypt will do that?
I think it's really hard to do that. Therefore, we also collaborated to of course, call on the international community to press the Egyptian government to respond. We have formed a coalition of Egyptian human rights that works on freedom of civic space and environmental issues. And this coalition have gathered efforts to create a petition that calls on to the Egyptian government to release thousands of detainees and to enhance its practices towards human rights. And we created a web space to carry this petition to the world and also to provide information on how to participate in COP27 meaningfully, how to amplify the Egyptian civil society demands into discussions and into conversations that we cannot be a part of. And also, we are sharing the stories of those detainees who have been detained for years without a real conviction or without a fair trial. And we are hoping that this will be a platform for the world to see the situation in Egypt and to engage in solidarity with those who are imprisoned or facing arbitrary detention. We are, for that, of course, we are creating a campaign that will start 26th of September and last until the 2nd of October. We'll call it, we call it the Egyptian Solidarity Week with the Egyptian prisoners. And we are hoping that everyone will participate in events and activities and post and share those stories of detainees. We are currently hoping that enough pressure between now and COP27 will be enough for the Egyptian state to respond to these demands, because we think that after COP27 ends and the world's eyes turns away from Egypt, that there will be a severe crackdown on those who participated in the conversation around COP27 or in the event, or even for those who mobilized for a better respect for human rights.
Scary. So, and you know, I always think sometimes covering Egypt, you hear so much bad news, like you say, like a severe crackdown, extrajudicial killings, medical neglect. Sometimes it's hard to be optimistic about the future. In your job in organizations like Committee for Justice, do you see tangible or concrete improvements in the situation in Egypt through work like your petition?
Actually, and unfortunately, and until now, no, we don't see any developments in regard even that the state announced a new strategy for human rights and announced a national dialogue and announced efforts to release some of the thousands of detainees. Egypt has released over about 300 detainees so far, claiming that they are taking steps to enhance the situation on human rights. However, the Committee for Justice documented since the day of the announcement of the national dialogue, only Committee for Justice documented over 1,000 cases of new arbitrary detention cases only in the period between April and June 2022. That's 2 months only of following the practice. Therefore, I here confirm that no, Egypt is not pretty serious about their initiative to enhance the situation. The national dialogue, I think, is just an attempt to whitewash all these practices right before the COP27 and of course the UN General Assembly and all the international attention. I believe that all efforts should be made now because maybe this is the moment to get some gains. While we're seeing them releasing 300 detainees and promising to amend the NGO law, this is, yes, a good response superficially, but including stakeholders from civil society, from those who are facing reprisals, those who are under travel bans, we'd like to see a good leap of faith to trust the government's initiatives and to be able to engage with it. However, we are afraid now that our engagement will give the state the entitlement of, see, we're including everyone, however, we'll be contributing to this theatrical attempt. We'd like to see concrete steps to trust the process and to believe that there is hope in a better future.
Okay, and just finally, you're a lawyer, that's what you do, that's your specialism, but you're dealing with a country, with a ruler who has consistently shown that he feels that he is above the law. So how do you apply the law, or how do you use the law in such a situation like that?
Honestly, Amelia, it's infuriating sometimes being a lawyer and understanding the complete disregard of rule of law, especially in a country like Egypt. Of course, we've been following all I call it the legal crackdown, because Egypt is not only committing neglecting due process, habeas corpus, all the rights to fair trial, but it's also making this very, very hard by legislating injustice, creating broad terms like terrorism and use it against human rights defenders, journalists, and lawyers systematically to keep them imprisoned indefinitely. These practices are pretty hard to understand for those who are not experienced on Egyptian law, because they mean for it to be so complicated so the world cannot understand the level of injustice that is going on. We have victims who have been imprisoned for almost 10 years, like Ala Abdel Fattah, who has spent over 170 days of hunger strike, and we believe that his life is in real imminent danger. And the Egyptian government, regardless of all the calls of the international stakeholders, regardless that Ala Abdel Fattah is carrying another nationality, the amount of stubbornness and addressing his issue shows that it's merely political, everything that is happening, not only against Ale, but against thousands of other detainees. And especially at this critical moment where we're addressing the environmental crisis, we're seeing that there are important environmental researchers and activists are suffering from this practice as well, for practicing fundamental human rights. Dr. Ahmed Al-Kholi, a professor of environmental planning at Cairo University, has been arrested since 2019 and has been imprisoned in pre-trial detention without conviction until now. Dr. Amesha is the same case. Engineer Ahmed Badawi, renewable energy engineer, has been detained without a trial also for 3 years, and many others. Muhammad al-Baqir, indigenous rights defender. What I'm saying is the hand of arbitrary detention is not only designed for a certain criteria. However, it's in the eyes of the states is a tool to reserve stability. And diplomatic relations, military assistance, agreements, and aid should take in heart that addressing the human rights issue should be embedded in these discussions. We need this type of pressure, and we need the world to acknowledge the human rights issue. And giving the law, we are doing everything to create a counter narrative to what the state is doing, state claiming that everyone in prison is a terrorist. And while this is not true, this needs some evidentiary work to document it and to get action, legal action, to be able to hold the state accountable eventually. We are using international legal mechanisms, though people say that it's weak, it's effectiveless, it's not that hard on the state. However, I believe that using international law tools strengthens them, and it opens the door for accountability at the end. We are hoping that this will form enough pressure on the Egyptian state, and especially at the time where the world is getting together in a discussion that is important for the humankind, human rights will be an approach to achieve this right. Addressing the environmental issue requires a holistic approach that centers human rights in the middle of every conversation. And we should send the message that there isn't environmental justice without human rights. There isn't environmental justice without a free civic space.
That's great. Thank you, Yasmin. I think that's a great place to leave it. Thank you to our wonderful audience for being here, and please do join us again next week. Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amelia.